Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Pedagogy Non Grata. I'm really happy to have Nathaniel Swain here today, and I'm especially happy that he stuck through all of our technical difficulties and scheduling challenges. I think we rescheduled 3 or 4 times, and I think this is our third take today because we kept having trouble with platforms. But Nathaniel is someone I've really admired for a long time in this field of education. I think he's both very articulate and charismatic. I started following him several years ago when he did a talk on faunus Pinal, and he was really looking at examining that program from a qualitative perspective. And at the same time, I was trying to analyze it from like a quantitative perspective, like does it work? And he was explaining why he didn't think it worked. And
Mm.
I thought it was really interesting to see that other perspective and get a deeper understanding of the program for myself. I think he's done a really fantastic job talking about explicit instruction. And he also happens to have the same first name as me. So this podcast is actually semi-retired, but I'm really happy to come out of semi-retirement to do a Nate squared episode or Nathaniel squared episode and do a deep dive on RTI. So it's really great to have you on the podcast, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Nathaniel and Nate. It's a great opportunity to get two Nates together in the same room. It doesn't happen very often, just so everyone knows. It's not a very common name, so we get pretty excited. But I have also been following your work for a long time, Nate, and have also appreciated all of the free stuff that you've given to teachers and to educators around the world, all your analyses of research, your systematic reviews that you've then gone and published, the work that you've done to bring people together to discuss the real issues as panels. I always love those episodes. We've got lots of experts in the room discussing cool things. So, the interest and the following is mutual. And I'm really pleased that you've paused the retirement of Pedagogy Non Grata to talk with me today.
Yeah, and I see you have my book behind you on the corner. That's pretty cool too.
Here you go.
I didn't know you had that, by the way. Although I admit I did see it in the earlier recording attempt here. But it's kind of cool just to see it there.
Oh, very,
Yeah,
very
and I,
nice.
I
Yeah,
will
come.
I will say Pedagogy not Grant is not fully retired. It's just a podcast, so I'll still be making free content.
Oh, good. That's a relief for all
And
the listeners,
doing
I'm
more
sure.
articles, but just way less podcast episodes. That's really what I mean.
Yeah.
And if Nathaniel can attest to this, I'm terrible at organizing these. It's a real pain in the neck for anyone who wants to organize a podcast with me.
Yeah.
Um,
And if you have two kids at
but
home, I think it's just everything's complicated. Like it's just all very difficult. So we've both got two kids, so we can attest to the fact that life is very complicated when your kids are quite young and life's intense.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Okay, so let's dive into our first topic. So that's RTI. I think there's a lot of confusion as to what RTI is. Even in schools where I've worked in, where we're doing RTI, I felt like the average teacher sometimes didn't know what that term meant. So
Mm.
maybe we could just start off by explaining to the audience what is RTI.
So response to intervention is essentially historically a move away from using diagnostic criteria and very intensive assessment protocols that maybe have been done by educational psychologists or special educators to determine who gets extra support, and instead letting students' response to the instruction or response to the intervention decide who gets more support. It's a really clever public health kind of style model in schools. It's not widely used in Australia. I think it's becoming more used now. I don't know how that compares to Canada, but it is an incredibly useful tool that allows the school to essentially respond to the students that are in front of them and to give more supports where it's needed, not where supposedly it might be needed according to some set of criteria. So
Yeah,
essentially, you've got tier one, two, and three, as many people would know. Tier one instruction is your general instruction that every single student gets. 80% ideally would only need tier one to get the improvements in reading and writing and mathematics that they need. Tier two is small group instruction, which is done on top of tier one where needed. And then tier three instruction or tier three, sorry, intervention is where students will get more specialized, small group or individualized support. And what I love about the model is that it adds more for students who need it. And it starts with a really solid base of tier one instruction. So everyone gets that access to the curriculum and excellent instruction to begin with.
yeah, I think that's a good explanation, and I feel like it's very popular in the United States from what I see in conversations. It's not popular in Canada.
Mm,
I'm one of the only teachers I know who's worked in an RTI school in Canada.
right.
But like, I hope it's something that expands. So something I hear about confusion about is like an MTS model versus an RTI model. How would you define that difference?
Yeah. So the main reason, I guess there's multiple terms floating around, is because MTSS is a broad umbrella term that talks about having those tiers that I mentioned, not just for academic pursuits, but also for behavioral and well-being sort of supports. So essentially, PBS is like the RTI for behavior, and it has that same approach where rather than having certain rules or expectations or certain interventions for just those students who particularly are acting out, it starts with a whole school approach to behavior, norms, and expectations. And as Tom Bennett likes to talk about, routines. And those basically set everyone up for success and build a strong culture of the school that should lead into nicely all that academic sort of work. Tier two instruction with PBS is going to be small group or additional supports that is for those students who are having trouble following those important expectations and norms or not knowing how to regulate for different purposes. And then tier three, more intensive again, maybe more individualized as well. So the MTSS, I think, is trying to take over as the term that people like. I still like the idea of RTI because it in its name it communicates a concept of what it's trying to do in terms of responding to what students need and whether they need more instruction. But I think if we can get behind the idea of whole school to begin with, tier one for academics and behavior, and then increasing sort of intensity and frequency of supports according to need, then that's what MTSS is trying to get across, I believe.
Yeah. Multi-tier systems of support is kind of a mouthful, I gotta admit.
It
Somebody
is,
did not do a
yeah.
good job marketing that.
No, it sort of doesn't sound very cool. Like it's incredibly powerful. Like it's a really
Yeah.
useful framework, but it doesn't roll off the tongue, as you said.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the evidence for it because I think there is some resistance, and I think some of the resistance is maybe from unlikely different parties. But one of the big ones I see is people who see themselves as like pro dyslexia advocacy sometimes seem resistant to RTI, which is ironic because it's also a kind of a popular idea in the science of reading movement. So,
Mm.
is RTI an evidence-based framework? Is MTS an evidence-based framework, would you say?
Yes, and I think it is very difficult to do things like randomized controlled trials for these kinds of approaches. The kinds of research that's out there is probably more longitudinal, maybe more sort of following particular students. So in the PBS or the behavior sort of support world, looking at what's called a single subject or single case design is really quite a useful framework where you're following particular students and seeing how different interventions are supporting them in different ways. But essentially, all that the observational longitudinal research is pointing towards the idea that these approaches do a good job of catering for what is probably a wide array of different needs. I wouldn't be able to point to many RCTs that have said, well, this one's going to do status quo and this one's going to do MTSS. But as we know, that's very hard to achieve in education with fidelity. One of the most important things about a randomized controlled trial is that students or teachers shouldn't actually know that they're in the trial or which group that they're in, so to speak. So they shouldn't know if they're the target group or not. And that's pretty hard to do when the teachers have to be really aware of what they're trying to achieve. So I don't know if we'll ever get really, really firm evidence like that. But similar to the arguments around smartphones at the moment regarding, how much evidence do we really need? Dr. Carl Hendrick did a great piece on his Substack this week around the longitudinal and observational correlational evidence that pointed to the importance of smoking or the importance of, sorry, not smoking, the importance of, the fact that smoking can be linked to cancer, as well as, the importance of seatbelts is what I was getting at as well. That you didn't need an RCT to sort of say, well, one state will do seatbelts, the other will not do seatbelts. We'll see what happens. You can see how cruel that would be. But I do feel strongly that the theoretical and the empirical research is converging on the view that, yes, we have students with different needs, but at the end of the day, most students need that core instruction as the starting point, the tier one, and that the trials and the longitudinal studies are showing that schools that are adopting these approaches that follow through with tier two and tier three are sort of getting that best of both worlds and allocating resources wisely. You don't want to have every single student, for example, getting individualized support because it becomes inefficient and unwieldy, and it's probably unnecessary for those kids that cope just as well with only tier one. But I'm interested. I haven't actually heard many of the critiques from dyslexia advocates of RTI. Like, what are those?
I think I've heard two critiques. One, I think, is that it's been in the United States sort of associated with some balanced literacy schools. So that some people
Ah, okay,
associate it as being like a whole language thing, which I
okay.
don't think is fair. I think it's just sort of correlation. Like that
It
school
might be
has
just an
recess and
unfortunate
that school
mix.
has whole
Yeah,
language.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
The other criticism I see is that, maybe we'll limit diagnostic assessments because, they want to make sure that their students are getting that full intensive intervention, and they're worried that if they don't have a proper diagnostic assessment, that they won't get all of the intervention and supports and accommodations that kid deserves. Um,
And I think those
and
two issues, just
Yeah,
from the outside looking
absolutely.
in, I think the obviously there is some benefit depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the legislative requirements and the how funding is sort of allocated. That if certain assessments or certain criteria end up getting more funding, like in Australia, we have something called the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is designed to allocate funds to students with identified disabilities as well as other members of the public with disability, and essentially. Those labels become really important. Interestingly, dyslexia is not one of those that really get a lot of attention or funding. It's not on the criteria. It's sort of seen as an educational challenge. But I think it does depend less on the research and more on the politics within your own jurisdiction as to how important that diagnosis is. Most students that have been diagnosed with, really significant dyslexia, for example, could easily have much less severity. So they've been given severe dyslexia as the diagnosis. If they had been given access to a school that has high impact research aligned reading instruction and also potentially has RTI, they may not have reached that level of severity. They may still have qualified for dyslexia because of other risk factors, but severity is actually a combination of risk factors from the individual and say family or genetic factors, for example, as well as how the teacher is working. This is why the term dysteachia has been thrown around as well as dyslexia, is
I
that
was just thinking about that.
it's an instructional casualty problem as well. And I think in Britain, for example, where there's a strong emphasis on diagnosis for dyslexia, that they've got really big statistics of the number of students that have dyslexia according to their screeners that they use, which probably not as rigorous as in some other places. They say sometimes as much as 15% of the population has dyslexia. Now that for me, that's a overblown overestimation of what counts as dyslexia. Sure, there might be 20 or 30% that have reading difficulties or reading disorder, but actually, many of those would probably be much more like instructional casualties. And it'll be really interesting in the next few years as they've had so much phonics and emphasis on reading approaches that align with the research in England, whether that statistic around the number of kids with dyslexia in the population is actually as high as that, or whether that number will shift. Because most estimates put it around 1 or 2%, or maybe 3 or 4, depending on how strict your criteria are.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I think um, part of it means, what do we mean when we say dyslexia too? And
Yeah,
that sounds
yeah.
like a controversial statement, but uh, I think what people really mean is that 15% of the population of students is not um, having a neurological condition, that a lot of that is socioeconomic factors or instructional factors.
Mm,
And that the percentage of students who really genuinely struggle to read for um, neurological reasons is much lower than 15%. Now, that'd be a guess. That's not an area I've studied.
mm.
But I'm always dubious of this just because I think we've had really bad instruction in the past, truthfully, globally on reading
Yeah.
in Western or English speaking nations.
English
So,
speaking, yeah. I think as well the point there is it gets thorny because there's been some great reporting and coverage of how black and brown students or students from disadvantaged areas don't always get a dyslexia diagnosis because maybe their reading difficulties are put down to something else. And if that's
yeah.
wielded in such a way that they don't get access to services, like you can't get special education unless you're believed to be privileged enough to benefit from it. I think that's where it gets really problematic. But this is a really difficult issue where, in some ways, I know that maybe dyslexia advocates don't like RTI, but the benefit of it is that it has a strong strong equity perspective on it. It doesn't really matter what your diagnosis is. It doesn't matter whether you qualify or not and whether your background is at risk or not. It's actually about whether you need the support. And a bit like how public health should be the same. It sort of says, doesn't screen for you at a hospital and say, well, do you deserve to get this treatment or not? They say, like, what are you presenting with? What interventions have been made available through primary and secondary health? Now you're in tertiary. Well, it's time to give you something really important to ensure that you get the best possible care. And I think education should be the same and not necessarily worry so much about this. I understand there's probably a cost there to some students, looking for that really specialized support. And I advocate for those parents who are obviously fighting the system a lot of the time and having to really justify the supports for their kids. But ideally, schools and other supports around schools would be set up so that every child gets access to that support, regardless of the wealth of the parent or the ability of the parent to sort of push for it. And I think RTI and MTSS set up a good platform for ensuring that resources are given to the students who need them the most, regardless of their background and regardless of what checklist they might have sort of passed.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you're saying. And I also don't want to make it seem like every dyslexic advocate is advocating against RTI. I've just seen some argue
And I think
against
that
it.
would be welcome criticism for some people who see maybe some schools are wielding RTIs as an excuse not to attend to some of
I
those
think,
learning difficulties, and that is a problem.
and for sure, and I think that happens. But I think ideally, like RTI, it's just an organizational system for organizing how much instruction which students are getting. And going back to what you're saying, I think, at the end of the day, we just want to make sure that all students who are struggling to read are getting additional supports
Yeah.
to help them learn how to read. That's regardless of diagnosis. And I almost wonder sometimes if the diagnosis can be a barrier, because if you're in a school district and say you only get tier 3 instruction if you have a diagnosis, well, not every school is at providing the resources to get those students diagnosed. Not every parent has the resources to do it themselves, and I think it actually could prevent more kids from getting access to high quality reading instruction.
And in that way, a diagnosis can open doors, but a lack of a diagnosis or the emphasis on meeting those criteria could actually close doors as well. So it's a double-edged sword in that way, which is hard for parents and hard for kids who are just looking to, learn how to read or learn how to do maths, for example.
Yeah, 100%. So let's dive into like RTI more as a model. And truthfully, I've seen the tiers defined very differently across the board. I think you've done a good job explaining like what those 3 tiers are. But like, let's look at what does that mean in practice. Like, what does tier 3 instruction look like in practice to you? What does tier 2 instruction look like in practice to you? And what does tier 3? And how are we defining those groups and those differentiations?
Mm. So there are some much smarter people than me who are experts on MTSS. So if I get anything wrong here, like I look forward to the comments in the in the chat or the feed. But
Tear them
I
to
think
pieces.
yes, and I am supervising an excellent PhD student who's about to finish. She's a teacher and an educational consultant as well. She's doing a whole PhD on MTSS for reading. Her name's Karina Stocker, and her research is going to be really helpful, I think, to further these conversations, particularly about how to implement MTSS well, and how to set everything up. So I'll try my best to represent that body of knowledge as it's evolving as I can, but just pull me up if I seem to get anything not quite right, because it's I really love the tier 1 instruction part of this model, and that's usually my big focus. But I'm happy to discuss, I guess, how it all sort of fits together. So for me, if we're starting at tier 3 is like your pinnacle of the amount of support. Ideally, your interventionist, your special educator, or your allied health professional who's working in that tier knows exactly what kinds of persistent difficulties kids with dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia tend to have, and essentially really good at getting over those stumbling blocks of providing a level of intensity or a level of support that allows students to experience success, given that that's sort of the end of the road regarding the intensity of support. When that's working well, it should be complemented by and shouldn't be necessarily really distinct from what is done in tier 2. It's just that tier 3 gives them more frequent, more intensive, and also probably more individualized feedback and support, shorter cycles between practice and improvement and error correction and so on. So essentially giving students, if it's for reading, those really strong supports in mastering that phonemic awareness that they need across different syllable types, of giving them automatic recognition of the code knowledge that they need in order to read, and then so automatic recall of the code knowledge they need to spell. And I think if you haven't cracked this as yet, if you're a teacher or a school leader listening, and you didn't realize this, working on spelling across all of these tiers has a huge benefit for reading. Working on just reading doesn't necessarily translate to spelling. So when you put more emphasis on the spelling and the recall of the phonics and the graphemes or the morphemes and so on, you actually are more likely to set up students to improve both reading and spelling at the same time. So it's a little hack. But so tier 3 is like the culmination of all of that. Tier 2, sort of one step down, is regular but small group instruction or intervention that is giving them an extra boost into the reading and spelling skills, usually if we're talking about literacy, that they are having more difficulty with. Some schools actually get so good at teaching reading and spelling that they actually start using MTSS for other things. Like they might start focusing in those small groups on sentence level grammar and getting that early writing skill sort of happening. They may also eventually start using the MTSS tier 2 and maybe tier 3 for language support. So oral language around vocabulary, comprehension, building up students' knowledge around topics that they're about to read about, knowledge-rich units that are coming up, and essentially giving students a second go at those complex concepts. So it really does depend on the array of difficulties, but my order of preference of targets for MTSS would likely, as you might have guessed, phonemic awareness and code knowledge, spelling, decoding, and then fluency. So that's reading and sort of spelling fluency. So that's the sentence dictation work. Then once you've got all of that sort of passage reading, fluency, and basic sort of comprehension and that sort of process. And then after that, sentence level writing and sort of grammar, morphology, obviously throw in there as well. And then broadening out to things like comprehension, vocabulary, and content knowledge. The reason for that is because the more students that are independently decoding and independently spelling, means that more likely they're going to access that meaning that is coming to them via text and probably not from anywhere else. Once you've got them accessing text, then maybe the job of MTSS is to ensure that they can really make meaning from that text, understand those words, get a second or sometimes a third dose of exposure to those new concepts or ideas, and give them that schema building opportunity so they can understand the difficult text that they might be reading about or the topics they might be grappling with, or give them another way to talk about or to reproduce ideas that they're sort of talking with their early writing skills. So just going back to tier 2 briefly, tier 2 is all about small group, but somewhat, very much connected to what has actually happened in tier 1. So it's like a second opportunity to learn that and to get that little bit more support from the teacher to be able to go deeper and to go more sort of cycles of feedback quickly in that maybe 45 or 40-minute session. Sometimes it might be 30 minutes. It really just depends on how much resources and time you have. And then to start the whole process, obviously, is that tier 1 instruction, which is ideally not just one size fits all, as I like to talk about. It's actually tier 1 is incredibly low floor so that all students benefit from that initial teaching. So there's examples in there that students should all be able to do, but no real ceiling. So that there's levels of challenge that are built into that tier 1 that allow all students to feel supported, but also challenged and get the maximum benefit of that, teaching for the whole class to begin with.
That was awesome. I agreed with every single thing you said there, actually. Um, I wanted to highlight two things that you said that I just thought I really agreed with, especially. One was your talk about the importance of spelling over
Hmm.
reading.
Hmm.
And I mean, everyone, there's so many people I can think of who I think are really experts in this field of education, and they all say that.
Mm,
Um, Dr. Timothy Shanahan has said something to that
mm,
effect. Dr. Pete Bowers has said something to that
mm,
effect. Lynn Stone has said something to that effect. And I think if you look at the research, it's backed and supported. Another thing I really liked in what you said was talking about how the primary things are that those phonological skills, that decoding skills, and that fluency piece. And I just feel
mm,
like that should be the primary goal of reading intervention is
mm,
to increase those, and then we can move on to other things once those fundamental building blocks are in place. But I think I agree, we need to start there.
mm,
Um, One thing I didn't hear you talk about was how do we decide what
mm.
tier a student is in? And I think that's actually one of the hardest questions.
Yeah. So obviously things like benchmark assessments, not the traditional benchmarks like F&P or PM and things like that, but assessments that allow you to get a sense of where your students are at, at the start of the school year, middle of the school year, and end of school year. Those are incredibly important. A lot of people are using Acadience or Dibbles, for example. It depends on your part of the world whether you pronounce it that way or not, but that's the dynamic indicators sort of assessment. Really powerful assessments that allow you to get to where your students are at and whether they're making progress very quickly. For those that are flagged as at risk, and those tools are designed sort of for MTSS because they have a traffic light system built into it to make it easy for teachers or leaders to use. Green or blue means they're on track or above. Yellow or orange means that they're potentially at risk or low level or mild level of risk, and then red would be high level of risk. Essentially, those assessments are a really good indicator. Might not be everything that you use to decide. You might also have curriculum-based measures that look at some of those other areas like spelling, or look at the content of the curriculum, their vocabulary and things like that as well. But essentially, those indicators on those core benchmarks should primarily decide whether those additional interventions happen. And schools that are getting this right are actually doing it sooner than you think. I know there's some schools that just leave intervention and don't do any tier two or tier three intervention until the second year of school. So that would be your grade one, I'm guessing, in Canada, first grade. But the ones in Australia, for example, that are really getting on top of this and closing those gaps fast are the ones that essentially do a little bit of light touch, small group intervention in the first few weeks of starting school. So this is the foundation or the preparatory year, sometimes called the kindergarten year, depending on your part of the world. So this first year of school is actually prime time to close these gaps. When they're first starting school, the gaps are this big. By the end of the first school year, the gaps are this big, and then so on and so forth. So how to decide when to do it? When is the sooner the better? The earlier you do it, the smaller the gaps you're trying to fill. And some students just need a little pep up in how phonemic awareness works, of just how do I do CVC blending? How do I break up words into sounds? I've never done that before. Don't know what that is. Some kids really struggle with it, but that intensive sort of additional small group, even if it's just tier two, could make a big difference at that time. And then otherwise, how do you decide when they move up? You're sort of using that benchmarking and the progress monitoring sort of assessments that happen more frequently with some of those tools like Dibbles and Acadience. You are basically able to tell whether there is improvement, whether they're tracking, whether they're falling further behind. And if you notice those red flags not going away, or if you notice that some are it's just stagnant, that's when you escalate to the next tier. If you've got students that are starting to make more progress, that are catching up, that's when you might, given your resources available, you might just bring them back down to just one tier rather than doing one and two. And that's the general principle of it. As I said, there's some much smarter people than me that focus all about progress monitoring and these magic sort of formulas on how to make it work. But if in general, this is the process that you're doing, and that you are being smart about your resources. So you're actually putting more resources in at the front end initially. Obviously not just forgetting about those sixth and fifth graders that really do need that support, but essentially trying to stop the pipeline of low progress readers right at the beginning actually saves you more resources to help those older students in the end.
Yeah, I agree with that. Is there a specific percentile that you would say that we put students into intervention at
Mm. So
on,
I
say, one of
think
those?
one of those benchmarks, yeah. Look, so are you talking there about percentile rank according to the assessment, or are you talking about the overall number of students that you might put into each category?
No, I mean according to the assessment. So, like,
Yeah,
let's say I have a kid on Dibbles at 40th percentile. Would you put
yeah.
them in an intervention, or was it what percentile would you use as your benchmarks?
Well, in my other, in my previous life, before I was a classroom teacher and a school leader, I was a speech pathologist, and the things we lived by was standard deviations and percentile ranks. The normal distribution is between 16 and 80, what is it, 84, on either side. So below 16 is essentially starting to move outside of that normal distribution or normal range, and it's below one standard deviation from the mean. So I would say that depending on your resources, anything below 16 or 17 on that percentile rank is definitely going to come up on your assessment, probably as a red flag or a yellow flag at least, and therefore be something
Yeah.
to target. But if you're seeing, you don't have to give huge amounts of intervention if they just happen to be a few points behind the mean. If it's like 40 or 45, this is actually within the normal distribution. So
Yeah.
anything below the mean doesn't necessarily mean bad. Just like anything above the mean doesn't mean extraordinary. It's these are the nature of these assessments, is that they tell you the broad sort of blunt sort of trends, and that over time the data following it longitudinally is going to be even more useful to sort of track whether students are staying on track or whether they're moving up or moving down. Less so than like, okay, you're a 40, we've got to worry about you being a 40. It might be 40 today, but a few weeks after they respond a bit more to that intervention, it might be 45, in which case we don't have to worry about some of that noise, but on either side of the 50th percentile. But definitely below 16, you're looking at, this is outside what was expected. And what that number means, it's not like an F&P or a PM benchmark or any of the other benchmarking assessments that used to be done on leveled readers. It's not an arbitrary decision that has been made. These percentiles are actually taken from tens of thousands of students that have been sat through these kinds of assessments and seeing what is expected in the general population, as well as what is required in terms of skills for them to access the curriculum, for them to be considered, able to continue and to progress and to not have barriers to their learning. So these numbers are really powerful, and they mean a lot more than, say, the letter that you used to get with, I don't know if that was big in Canada as well, the A to Z of
Yeah.
benchmarking.
We
It's
had that for sure.
right. Those are more akin, and it sounds very harsh, more akin to a horoscope than a number that you can really make some meaning from. So I think the data sort of centered people, the people that understand and really love getting into the data at your particular school, make sure that you do have an opportunity to deep dive and really make sense of it, and to see not just that moment in time, but what has happened in a 3 month or a 6 month period at your school, and seeing if you are closing the gap between some of your weaker and your stronger readers or decoders or spellers, because those numbers are, ones to watch, not just ones to check once and then sort of make a decision that then doesn't adjust from there.
Yeah. I thought that was really well put. I think one thing, it's funny you talked about like what do these numbers mean and people being really worried about a 40. And I've seen that online. I've seen people say like we want everybody in our school to be at the 70th percentile. And
Okay.
I've
Yeah.
just been like, well, that's just never going to happen. Like
Mm.
mathematically speaking, I think because we're so primed because we think of them as grades, right? Like you hear the kid is in the 50th percentile and people are like, oh, that's a D minus. That's terrible. And it's like,
Yeah,
no,
no,
actually,
it's not a
like,
percent, it's a
that's an
percentile.
average.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 50th
Yeah.
percentile is good. Like, yeah, I think this is where it is a risk sort of rating. It's not like a grade, as you're saying. So we're not aiming for everyone to get to the 100th percentile or even to the 70th percentile is still like out of control. Mainly because like
That'd be
to
wild.
get all students there, you have to think, is it necessary? Does it actually give them an advantage? And what are you squeezing out of the curriculum to sort of push that drilling that would potentially move those numbers up? There's always going to be a normal distribution, hopefully a normal one, and not, sometimes there's bimodals where there's heaps of kids that are doing super well and heaps of kids that are doing super badly. Like that's a bad distribution. A normal distribution is what we sort of aim for, is that some kids will be amazing at things, other kids will find things more difficult. Ideally, the lower ends of your normal distribution just doesn't have a really long tail. And that long tail of underachievement, as my colleague, Professor Pam Snow, loves to talk about, ideally is as short as possible, so that as most amount of kids are reaching the benchmarks that they can. And in many ways, you might find, if you're doing your job well, that your normal distribution just shifts. So you might not have it that every student reaches 70, but you might have that your mean changes from 50, which is where you probably expect it to be in a regular school, in schools that I've worked with and in schools that I've featured in my book, for example. They've essentially moved their normal distribution across, so their average is 65 or so. And yes, they've got students above that and below that because it's still a distribution. But ideally, they just don't have so many students that are really at risk or really behind. And if they're doing that, then that's good public health as education. It's like you're preventing huger problems down the line, but also knowing that some people will be excelling and going much further than that. And that's, all the factors that are coming together. The school-based factors is only part of it. There's obviously the family-based and early childhood sort of based factors that determine students' performance. We can only stress about the things that we can control, and getting everyone to 70 is probably not a realistic goal.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree with all that. I will say, like, just personally, in my own classrooms, I always use the 30th to the 20th percentiles, like my tier two benchmarks.
Oh yeah.
So if a student is like 20 to 29, I give them like sort of tier two instruction.
Yeah,
Whereas if they're
great.
below that 20th percentile, then it's like we're gonna work together on all my preps. Like this is gonna be intensive intervention
Yeah.
for
And I think
you.
those numbers
But
will depend on the amount of resources that you have. At the end of the day, it's semi-economic as well as a public health model, RTI, because it's about how many resources do we have, what can we put those resources into, and how can we best make use of them so that we essentially create less problems for those students, but also less problems for the school as a whole later on, so that there's more money to go around to help those students that need the most. So it's a way of trying to optimize that. So if you've got the resources for it and you know that you can provide those tier two instructions, then those cutoff points might be different for you. But this is where it's less of like there is only one answer because someone said so. It's more just obviously more is going to be more beneficial and better, but throwing one caveat to that is that throwing everything and drilling students intensively without spacing between those sessions, for example, you might say, oh, let's do two intensive sessions, two like 5 times or 6 times a week. Like that's probably not necessarily going to do everything because there may well be a saturation effect where they need time between the sessions to let the brain start to forget or start to prune away some of those understandings to then sort of get towards that mastery. There is probably a limit to what you can do. And you'd hate to see some schools going to the extremes that just because we've got $100,000 to spend here, we're going to get kids just drilled, intensively and all this stuff without necessarily having that benefit. Because learning is a process of, information coming in, of trying to be retained and moving up to long-term memory, but then being pruned away as well and sort of leaving just the best bits. And there is probably a saturation effect. And I think that would probably happen in the certain parts of the world where cramming or studying over the top to all hours of the night is a cultural sort of issue. Is that I'm sure it lifts up the mean or it lifts up the performance, and many of those countries that have those cultural practices do really well. But there would be a saturation effect where it's like actually you're probably too tired and too overloaded, and what you really need to benefit from your learning right now is to sleep, because sleep is really important for learning as well as all of that extra instruction. So I've gone a little rant there about over intervention, but I didn't expect that to happen today. But I think that's always a risk when people take these numbers and say, we're just going to do more, 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 because ideally you don't have all the resources in the world, because you have to think smart about how you're spending them and what you're spending that time on. And it should be equitable, not equal necessarily.
yeah, I agree with all that. I think it's a really practical thing. And I think sometimes we forget about that is that these are economic decisions. Somebody
Mm.
has to fund the teachers, the tier three support teachers to come into these schools. And
Mhm.
if you say, every kid below the 50th percentile is going to get intervention at a tier three level, well, that would cost an enormous fortune. You wouldn't even find enough teachers to achieve that
Mm.
goal.
And that's money that
Uh,
couldn't be spent on, other things, other important parts of the curriculum. And I hate to see people cut like their extracurricular activities and say we're just going to put all of that money into intervention, because, you can't. You can't think that the only output of school is just getting as many students to that arbitrary benchmark that you've created. There's obviously you want your school
yeah,
to be a happy, functioning place, and for kids to really enjoy their time there as well. So I think it is possible to get both of those things right when you're smart about the resources and the time that you sort of have.
yeah, I agree. I think you raise a good point by saying it's an arbitrary benchmark. At the end of the day, we put so much thought and talk into like getting kids to grade level, but it's just the whole idea of grade level is just a social construct.
It
Every
is,
every
and it's a
nation,
good thing to
every
aim
group
for.
has a different
Yeah,
definition.
it is. It's
Yeah,
also arbitrary. Like the curriculum is arbitrary. It's what we decide. Some
yeah,
curriculums around the world are much higher expectations. Some are lower. Like in Australia, we've got relatively low expectations in what we tend to cover, especially with regards to content knowledge. So ideally, it's high expectations. It lifts students up, but there's just so many decisions when you're a school leader or as a policymaker in this space, because it's all time that you spend on one thing that you can't spend on something else. It's basic sort of economics of time and resources.
okay. I'm gonna give you, in the interest of time, because I know we're probably going later than we anticipated here. Going to give you one more RTI question and then two broad questions. So
All right.
my last RTI question is, um, um, one of the things that I sometimes see with RTI and how it's constructed is that we pick which students are getting intervention at the beginning of the year, And then we do that for the entire year. And those
Hmm.
groups, they don't change over time. And in
Hmm.
some schools, they're changing those groups continuously throughout the year as like sort of a fluid model. And I'm
Hmm.
curious if you would argue more for a fixed model or a fluid model in designing your RTI in a school.
I think if your ITI is set up so that you are going earlier and you're going more intensive at the front end of the school, then it has to be a fluid model. Sometimes you will choose students that look like they're at risk, but actually they may be just late starters or they may be late sort of flourishes in that way. And they just needed one or two things and then it clicks for them. So if we are over giving intervention, we're also taking away resources for another student. So I would say a fluid model that does consistent sort of benchmarking and progress monitoring to ensure that the right students are getting the intervention that they need is pretty essential because I think you can easily get it wrong at the start of the year. The most important use of data is not static, it's actually longitudinal, it's dynamic, and that you're looking at trends and what students are doing over time as a better indicator of what they're needing or what they're not needing than say one sort of arbitrary test at the start of the year. It's neater and it's easier to just keep it static and to keep it the same, but it doesn't necessarily reflect what students might need. It's, actually, I've had enough phonemic awareness right now. I need to focus on sentence structure or I need to move on to handwriting or whatever it might be. And then if we just say, well, you're in this group for the whole year, so suck it and see, you may well find students end up exhibiting signs of people who really hate this kind of way of thinking or just love it if teachers could just sit around in circles and read stories to students and not worry about all this nasty sort of data stuff. Their complaints may well come to the surface of the students that aren't into that intervention anymore. They're not loving it. Anytime students are getting having to do something that they already can do or are asking to go through an intervention that's not needed, it is potentially going to affect their motivation and mean that they're also, remember, every time you do intervention, they're missing out on something else. So they're missing some core instruction, they're missing hopefully a different subject or a different part of the week each time, so they're not always missing the same session. But you don't want to overdo it and keep it static in who is in which group, because as soon as you can get them back into just lots more tier one, the more beneficial for their ability to focus on other parts of the curriculum. It isn't just about reading and maths at the end of the day. It's about how all of those skills come together to learn rich knowledge, to solve interesting problems, and to move students from novices in whichever domain you're interested in into more expert like. And interventions are not always set up to teach content in that way. That they're set up to give students the skills they need to then access that content. So as soon as you can specialize and say, well, you know what, you've got the reading fluency that we're looking for. Let's bump you down from tier 3 to tier 2 and see if that's enough. Okay, 3 months later, you've tested again. Okay, it looks like, well, maybe even earlier, it looks like tier 2 is not necessary anymore as well. You're easily in the green or you're safely across that line. We'll just get you back into the tier 1 instruction alone. And then it does feel like a sense of achievement when students, progress through and make progress in that way. Because this is basically saying you don't need this anymore. You're ready to go back and get just classroom instruction all the time. So I think I don't know if your question was set up to be so easy to answer, but it's obvious to me that setting the groups at the start of the year for me has serious limitations because you don't know what students are going to be able to do in response to that intervention.
Yeah, I might have had a bit of a selfish motivation answering asking that question because I've seen that implemented in that model of using the fixed model of RTI,
It's
where
easier
you
for
decide the
teachers to
groups
get
we
their
get there.
heads around, yeah, but it's not beneficial necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a terrible model.
Yeah.
But so
Okay,
I'm
good. I've
glad to
answered
hear you.
correctly. Tick. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have to edit this part out. No, I wouldn't have done that anyways. I would have just had a different comment afterwards. Uh, I really there was something in there though that I thought was just a nice gem, and it was something I'd never thought of, and I really want to highlight it. And you talked about how doing it at a different time of day, so that we're not always taking from the same subject. And I think that's really important to point out. It's not something I personally consider, but because one of the difficulties of a tier 3 model is you have to take from somewhere else the day. Like
You
if you're
do.
going to provide tier 3 instruction, either you're going to take from that subject, which I think is the worst possible decision, to take the kid out of the subject they're struggling with to give them intensive instruction. But then if you're not doing that, then you got to steal time from another subject. And
Yeah.
the easy one is to be like, well, we're going to steal from gym and art or music. or drama.
Which is
But
not great, is it? Because you only get one of those a week. So it means you're always missing that subject and you never get any art. And I think for parents, if they knew that that was the case, they probably wouldn't be so happy about that. Like, there are some difficult decisions in high school or middle school where some students are still needing intervention, a significant intervention, and a lot of schools take that road of saying we probably will just take them out of second language instruction. And for language teachers, that must break their heart because this is a really important aspect. Bilingualism and multilingualism is so important for the longevity and the cohesiveness of our planet. But I think some people in high school do make that tricky decision, and parents sort of can cope with that, given that they're trying to get their head around one language. It might not make as much sense for them to learn a second. I'm not always comfortable with that, but I also know there's not many other choices. But yeah, I agree that changing the subject they get taken out of, or the session that gets taken out of, if it's the generalist classroom instruction, is actually really important because otherwise you've swapped one for the other, and that's actually not RTI. RTI has to be tier one plus two, and then plus three if necessary, not instead of. Um, my other bugbear, I don't know if you've had this one as well, Nate, is when people might have that sort of feeling that to be more inclusive, we need to do the tier two or tier three instruction in the same space as the classroom instruction, because the pull-out method is somehow seen as sort of not inclusive, really misunderstands the purpose of RTI. The purpose is you don't keeping them in the room doesn't make it more inclusive. It actually just increases the background noise for both the person getting the intervention and the person not getting the intervention. What's more inclusive is to ensure that those sessions are really effective, and a quiet room where students can focus and concentrate will make them more effective and means you don't have to spend the whole set. You might do 20 or 30 minutes of quality rather than 60 minutes of disruption. So I think getting them out, pulling them out, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it helps make that session work better. But then getting them back in and ensuring they're not always pulled out in the same subject, because then they're missing a whole chunk of the curriculum. So yeah, my bugbear around pullouts and some arbitrary idea of like somehow having them in the room makes it more inclusive, I think really forgets about what the purpose of that session is. It's to provide intervention, and for that to work, the students need to be able to hear and focus, and they can't do that if they're constantly looking at what the rest of the kids are doing and what they're missing out on.
yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think that sort of sits on the idea of like equity for the purpose of like supporting all the students' needs in the classroom versus equity for checking a box.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
sometimes we definitely do that. Um, um, so I'll give you my two final questions, and the first one is, what do you think is the biggest myth in education overall? This might be just a question I ask anyone who comes on in future onto the podcast. So there'll be very few guests coming on into the future,
Oh,
but
but well, okay, it might be the last time someone answers this question.
it could be, yeah.
Look, I think by and large, there's two that I'm tossing up between two.
You
Ooh,
just
which one
go
should
from
I
both.
do?
Let's hear it.
Oh, I'll go for both. Okay, the first one, I would say the myth that children learn differently and every child learns differently. I think this is a persistent issue where people focus on surface level differences between people that, there might be inherent things about their personality or what they like or their preferences that then are generalized to that they must then therefore learn differently because we are different, therefore we learn differently. As I've made the case in different publications and as many cognitive scientists have tried to stress, the learning system is relatively straightforward in its components. There's a few different components to the cognitive architecture. There's the environment of incoming information. There's the attentional sort of system. There's working memory and there's long-term memory. And there's processes where all of those things interact. There isn't a different system for different students. They might just have, some of them are gifted with a huge working memory that allows them to cope with more incoming stimulation and hold it in their mind at once. Some students have more in their long-term memory that they can draw upon to make sense of incoming information and therefore not get overwhelmed. But essentially, all students benefit from the same kinds of instruction, the same kinds of ways of breaking down information as per cognitive load theory, and the same kinds of targets for things like reading and writing. Like certain kids don't need to explore reading and writing through color or through hands-on experiences more so than anyone else. They actually just need good instruction that gives them all the access to the big five or the big six of reading, for example. So that's one of
Yeah,
the biggest myths because I think that feels right and it feels good. Yeah, some people like discussing, other people like reading, some people like watching things. And it's like, yeah, they might like all those things, but at the end of the day, information processing model, the simple model of the memory in the mind, is the same for everyone. It's just that some students have certain parameters that are easier for them, harder for them. They've got more of a background in other things, and so on and so forth. But everyone takes in information, tries to hold in their mind, ideally encodes it in long term, and when they go to sleep at night, the forgetting curve dictates that a lot of things get pruned away. That's just the system. And so therefore you don't have to tailor your instruction to all of these tiny little itty bitty preferences as per learning styles or multiple intelligences. You should tailor your instruction based on what students already know, so their background knowledge, and it's that meaningful learning theory connection. Ensuring that you know what they know already, so then you know how to break it down and how to connect it and know what's an important chunk for us to focus on next. And ideally, you give them those meaningful experiences that allow them to get more and more in their long-term memory, so students get access to that powerful knowledge or powerful skills that they need. It's not about different, it's about more effective, I think, for all students. Some students need more instruction, but they don't necessarily need different instruction, is sort of the main point there. So that's my first one. I don't know what you think about that.
Agree with all that. I agree with all that.
Oh, yeah.
Truthfully, in fact, that might be the myth that started this podcast, actually. So
Aha.
you're really speaking to my heart here. All
Okay,
right. So
well, and
what's the
here's the
next
other,
myth you want to talk
here's
about?
the last one I'll share with you, and this one's also one of my bugbears. So there's still an obsession, even by teachers that have embraced this work and are changing up their classroom instruction or the way their school runs. There's still this long-held belief that somehow students discovering or making a connection for themselves is more meaningful, more poignant, and therefore more effective. They're not. And I don't know, I don't think there's actually any evidence to show that if students discover something for themselves, it makes more long lasting memories or makes it more important. Actually, what we need to do is flip that whole myth around and point out that humans have accumulated vast amounts of knowledge and information in the last 10,000 years. And in the last 5,000 years, it's been written down rather than just passed on sort of verbally or through oral histories and things. That knowledge obviously extends in my context, in one of the longest standing generations or living cultures alive. So 65,000 years is one of the estimates based on carbon dating, for example. That's the indigenous peoples in Australia. Essentially, that knowledge is vast. That knowledge is very difficult to understand, especially the stuff that's been written down, the stuff that's been developed through science, the arts, and humanities, for example, is really complicated. And it's not like the kind of knowledge that's easy to pick up through social acculturation or through just seeing and observing. But what's really cool about our system is that when students are given good explanations, good modeling, and good demonstrations, our superpower is learning from each other. No other animals around the world can do that. We are really good at teaching and learning when we break that learning down and make it manageable and give really good models and demonstrations. So this myth of like, oh, don't tell them because they just need that opportunity to figure it out for themselves. I think it speaks to this Rousseauian sort of romanticism around teaching should be a process of students unlocking their unmet potential and things like that. And I think just you don't have to move into such a cold and sort of harsh sort of lens in counter to that, but be skeptical around those fluffy messages, because at the end of the day, whether someone's discovered something for themselves or whether they've actually been told something really important and poignant that's really connected with them, doesn't really matter where the source of the information is. It's the power of the information and the fact that humans can learn from getting access to that at the right time, in the right moment, maybe as part of a curriculum that sort of spells out these big ideas or big sort of picture skills and pulls them all together. So if I could get rid of that myth, that would be great, because some people deep in their heart feel that students should be allowed to sort of struggle or should be allowed to flounder through materials in the hope that they might make some of these connections. But I feel like you can let those students make those connections regardless of where that information is coming from by just giving really good instruction. And I love Tom Sherrington's mode A and mode B instruction distinction here, where mode A is all of the Rosenshine explicit instruction and Archer, EDI sort of stuff. It's about really good teaching. As I've said, we have this superpower of learning from really good teaching. And mode B is when you say, okay, we've gotten a certain amount of knowledge, we've gotten a certain amount of insight and skills. Now it's your chance to sort of break free and do all kinds of cool things. And I think that is a more genuine attempt to get to that romanticism and that excitement and open-endedness about learning without, what the opposite is, withdrawing or withholding information in order to somehow orchestrate a light bulb moment. Kids have light bulb moments all the time. You don't have to try and lay out a difficult path for them to get there. You can make the path as easy as possible, because then once they're moving into that mode B instruction of open-ended inquiry and exploration, they can forge their own paths because you've given them all the tools. And it's an equitable solution to what is a fairly inequitable idea, the fact that students should be allowed to struggle and flounder in the hope that they get a light bulb moment. And that's my rant now completed.
Yeah, you know what? I'm just thinking of Zach Rochelle's right now book, Just Tell Him.
Yes,
Uh,
and he says it beautifully, and avoids this, undermines this myth beautifully. So I, definitely doff our hat to Zach's work in this space.
yeah. So this brings me to my final question. Actually, your answer was the perfect segue into it. And I think, I agree with everything you said. I agree that there's a sort of over romanticism in the education industry that's sort of its own biggest problem.
Mm,
But at the same time, I think you and we have to acknowledge that we also exist within bubbles and camps and biases. And,
mm.
both of
Yep.
us clearly exist in a camp that is pro explicit instruction, pro science, and is sort of more skeptical of an over romanticized view of education. Um, so, in the interest of being, introspective, sorry,
Mm,
and
mm,
honest with ourselves and aware of our own biases, are there any myths that you see within your own camp?
mm.
Anything that you would see that is an idea that you would like to dispel within your own side of that sort of argument?
Great final question. I would say that a lot of teachers, when they're first implementing approaches that might fit within that mode A sort of explicit teaching, explicit instruction, responsive teaching might be another a term for it, where you're really guiding and responding to students' needs, but essentially the teacher directing that work and fading themselves out, hopefully, that it is possible to think that more is more. A bit like the more intervention is better, and that you're going to, as I say with Zach in one of the chapters in my book, you're going to sage it up all day essentially. So I'm just going to be this person that controls every single thing that the students are doing, and there's no room for students to explore or to question or anything like that. I'm just going to go whole hog, and I think it actually comes down to a teacher cognitive load thing. So when teachers are first getting their head around mode A instruction, explicit or responsive teaching, for example, it's easy for them to think that that's how I'm going to teach all the time. And that's the only way I'm going to teach. And it is sometimes hard to hold two somewhat conflicting, but maybe more accurately, intention ideas at once. That the purpose of teaching explicitly and responsively and in a way that gives them access to powerful knowledge and skills is not so that they can master the test or so that they can get the benchmark or so that they can get the exam result that they can, but because education actually has a fundamental, benefit to the individual, to society, to culture, to the passing on of information from generation to generation. And that doesn't come straight from the teacher's head or from the exam book. That comes from the benefit of learning in and of itself. So I think as long as we check our biases in this camp and say, you know what, I think I've gone too hard and I've saged it up too much, I probably need some space in my unit planning or my curriculum where students can break free, where they can apply and extend and explore things or read for, pure enjoyment and no other sort of consequences. All of that is, I see, completely compatible with being an excellent, responsive, and explicit instructor, because it's all about how we grapple with those multiple purposes of education. We don't want students to just be robots that master these arbitrary set of skills. We want these skills to open up and awaken all this, interest and excitement about the world. And ironically, we're in an age where students are becoming much more insular and closing in, and their world's becoming narrower and narrower as the algorithm feeds them more and more specific, probably horrible content. And so if education can have a role in broadening students' perspectives, in broadening how they see the world, how they see themselves, then this is what it's all for. It's like we're not being explicit instructors for arbitrary reasons, but because education is just so important that we want to get it right. So that's a myth, maybe, is that saging it up all day long might be what some teachers get to as the excesses of explicit instruction, and that I can easily see that you can have the best of both worlds if you get your head screwed on correctly and check your biases, as you're encouraging me to do with this question.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with everything you said, and I think that might be the number one thing I've said in this podcast because I believe I've said it about 10 times now. Um, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you and have you on the podcast. You are someone I wanted to have on this podcast for a long time, so I'm glad we finally did that. Where can people find more about you? I think I see your book on the back shelf there too.
Here it is. Yeah, just here. Yeah.
Yes, there you go. Where can people get that? Yeah, let's promote you a little bit here.
Thank you very much. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure, Nathaniel. Like I have always admired your work as well, and this has been such a pleasure. People can hear more about my work at nathanielswain.com. It's Swain spelt the same as brain. Don't put an extra E on the end. Some people do that. I don't know why. And I'm actually really excited to be working a lot with schools. I'm actually coming to Canada. I can't exactly say what the conference is, but I will be there next year, and I'm going to bring the whole family. We're going to make a whole trip of it. So look out for announcements about that. I'm also very excited to launch a new professional learning platform very soon, which is designed to take all the work that I do with schools, those in-person PDs and whole school coaching days, into manageable chunks and into bite-sized PL that you could use individually or use back at your school. The platform is called Luminary, and it's going to be targeted to be an affordable and accessible solution to what is a pretty overwhelming space with all of the different ideas that teachers have to get their heads around that they probably should have learned back at university or in college. So I'm excited to see you there. Look for it, the announcement in the next couple of weeks. And if you want to be one of my early testing schools, feel free to sign up. It'll be heavily discounted in the next 3 months to get as much feedback from the public as possible. And then Luminary will grow and launch properly before the end of this calendar year.
That's awesome. I'll be sure to promote that when it comes out.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, Nate.